The boy had no memory of when he first began watching the moon. It felt as though he had always been looking up, his neck tilted back, his eyes tracing that pale, patient circle drifting through the dark. While other children learned the shape of roads and rooftops, he learned the phases of light, how the moon thinned like a secret, how it grew bold and round as a promise. His name was Elior, and he lived in a village where nights were quiet and predictable. Doors closed early, lamps dimmed at the same hour. People believed the dark was something to endure, not to question. But Elior questioned it every night. He would climb onto the roof of his family's house, the clay tiles warm from the day, and lie flat on his back. The sky spread above him like an endless storybook, and the moon was always the first word. It seemed closer to him than to anyone else, close enough to speak to, if one only knew how. Elior spoke anyway. He told the moon about the village that never dreamed big enough, about the way his chest felt too full of unnamed feelings. He told it about his loneliness, though he didn't yet have the language for that word. He spoke softly, afraid of waking the night, afraid of being laughed at by the stars. The moon never answered, but it never looked away. There was something unusual about Elior's watching. The longer he stared, the more the night seemed to bend toward him. Shadows leaned closer. Wind paused to listen. Even the crickets sometimes fell silent, as if waiting for the moon to speak back. The elders of the village warned children not to linger under moonlight. It pulls at the soul, they said. It makes you want things that do not belong to you. Elior listened to their warnings and felt them settle somewhere deep, but curiosity is louder than fear when you are young. One night, as the moon rose higher than usual, Elior felt something change. Not in the sky, but inside his chest. A warmth bloomed there, gentle and aching, like homesickness for a place he had never been. He raised his hand, just slightly, not meaning anything by it. The moon shimmered. Elior froze. His breath caught. The light trembled, as though it had noticed him at last. For the first time in his life, Elior understood something without being told. The moon was not just an object in the sky. It was listening, and somehow, impossibly, it was close enough to reach. The boy lowered his hand, heart pounding, unaware that this small, instinctive gesture had already altered the shape of his fate. Far above him, the moon glowed, patient, curious, and quietly awake. And for the first time in centuries, it wondered what would happen if it leaned a little closer to the earth. Crescent moon. Elior did not sleep after that night. He lay awake on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling while moonlight crept through the window in slow, deliberate strokes. The light touched the floor, then the wall, then finally his face, as if it were searching for him. He felt seen in a way that was neither frightening nor comforting, but profoundly unfamiliar. When morning came, the village looked the same. Chickens scratched the dust. Merchants argued over prices. Children ran barefoot through the narrow paths, laughing without knowing why. Yet Elior moved through the day with the quiet certainty that something had shifted. The world had not changed, but his place in it had. That evening, he returned to the roof earlier than usual. The sky was still bruised with twilight, the sun retreating reluctantly as if it sensed it was surrendering its place to something more curious. Elior sat cross-legged, hands resting on his knees, his heart beating faster than the coming night required. "Did you hear me?" he whispered, feeling foolish for asking the sky a question. The moon had not yet risen, but the air felt charged, tight like a breath being held. As darkness settled, the stars appeared one by one, blinking awake. Then, slowly, deliberately, the moon emerged, larger than Elior remembered, its edges soft and luminous. He swallowed. "I didn't mean to," he began, then stopped. He wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. The moonlight spilled over the rooftops and washed over him. It felt warmer tonight, almost alive. Elior felt it press gently against his thoughts, not invading them, but brushing past them the way water brushes stone. For the first time, the moon responded, not with words, but with feeling. A memory that wasn't his flickered behind his eyes. Endless watching, endless waiting, centuries of drifting silence. The loneliness of height, the burden of distance. Elior gasped, clutching his chest as the emotion passed through him like a tide. I didn't know, he whispered, tears stinging his eyes. I didn't know you were alone too. The moon brightened, just slightly, as if in acknowledgement. From that moment, a strange exchange began. Each night, Elior spoke, and each night, the moon listened. When he was quiet, the light lingered longer. When he was sad, clouds parted without explanation. When he laughed, the stars seemed sharper, more awake. But listening has consequences. People in the village began to notice the nights growing brighter, longer. Shadows fell at odd angles. Dogs howled at nothing. The elders whispered among themselves, casting uneasy glances toward the sky. Elior noticed something else. The moon was closer. Not by distance measured in miles, but by presence. By intimacy. It felt nearer to him than the roof beneath his feet. And with that closeness came a dangerous thought, soft at first, then insistent. If the moon could listen, could it be held? Elior did not say the thought aloud. But the moon, now fully attentive, felt it all the same. Above him, ancient light wavered. And for the first time, the moon wondered what it might cost to be touched. The village slept early, as it always had. The streets were quiet by 9, the lamps guttered softly in their iron holders, and the wind carried the smell of wood smoke through the narrow alleys. Inside, families huddled under blankets, counting the hours until the sun would rise again. But on the rooftops, Elior was wide awake, his eyes tracing the edges of the moon like a bird circling a hidden nest. Tonight, the moon seemed heavier, hung lower in the sky as if leaning toward him. Elior felt it in his bones, a pull gentle yet unrelenting. He stretched out his hands, trembling, imagining, just imagining, what it would be like to scoop the pale light into his palms. The first stars of evening flickered nervously, as if warning him against foolishness. The village below lay in perfect order, unaware of the strange gravity of a single boy in a celestial body leaning closer to Earth. One could almost hear the universe holding its breath. Why do you watch me? He whispered to the moon. Why do you stay? And for a moment, the moon's light shimmered differently, warmer, softer, almost breathing with him. Elior had begun to sense something impossible, that the moon was not just light and distance, but a living presence, patient and sentient, capable of hope, and maybe longing. He remembered the elders' warnings. The moon pulls at the soul. It makes you want things that do not belong to you. He shivered, recalling their voices echoing through the stone corridors of memory. But the warning seemed trivial now, meaningless in the face of this quiet, monumental closeness. Elior leaned forward on the sloping tiles, letting his fingers hover over the roof's edge. He imagined the silver light pooling in his hands, warm as water. The thought startled him, how fragile, how impossible, yet how utterly consuming it felt. Then he noticed something unsettling. The moonlight had begun to leave traces. On the rooftops, thin lines of silver appeared where the beams touched. On the walls, the pale glow lingered long after his eyes moved elsewhere. It was as if the moon had begun to obey him, or perhaps to acknowledge him as someone who could see it, not just look at it. A sound reached his ears, low and strange, almost like a sigh. The village dogs stirred, their ears pricked toward the sky. A soft wind whispered through the chimneys. Even the crickets seemed to pause, listening. Elior's heart raced. He had never felt so connected, yet so small. The moon was immense and timeless, and here he was, a boy on a clay rooftop, daring to hope he might hold even a fragment of it. He closed his eyes. The warmth of the night wrapped around him, a silken promise. Somewhere deep within, he understood the truth of the moon's attention. To borrow from the moon is to risk touching eternity, and eternity is never gentle. And yet, as he opened his eyes and the moon shimmered directly above, pale and luminous, Elior whispered, barely audible, "I wish I could hold you." For the first time, the universe seemed to tremble. The night was still, but it felt alive in a way that made Elior shiver. Every shadow seemed to stretch, every rustle of leaves carried a secret meaning, and every shimmer of starlight pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. He had climbed to his favorite rooftop long before sunset, carrying a small, tattered notebook he had begun to fill with sketches and thoughts about the moon. Elior traced its light across the rooftops with his finger, as if he could draw a path from the tiles to the sky itself. The moon hovered, luminous and patient, responding to his gaze with a subtle glow that warmed his cheeks and made his chest ache. "Will you come closer?" he whispered. The words felt ridiculous in the emptiness, but he could not stop himself. The moon shimmered. A thread of light, silver and soft, stretched downward, brushing against the tiles like a feather. Elior's eyes widened. He could feel it, delicate, teasing, almost tangible, like a whisper made of liquid light. He lifted a hand, trembling. The air above his fingers pulsed. He began, unsure what to say, "I just want to understand you." The moon responded not with words, but with movement. The silver thread twined closer, wrapping around the edges of his hand as though testing him, probing him, curious about this small creature daring to touch the impossible. It was gentle, yet the sensation left him breathless. He could feel the weight of eternity, soft but immense, pressing against the tips of his fingers. For hours, Elior and the moon stayed like that, boy and celestial body, hand and light, without speaking. He felt the pulse of time slow, the world below receding into quiet, the village sleeping as though nothing extraordinary were happening. Yet he knew, deep in his bones, that something extraordinary had begun. He wondered about the cost. He had heard stories, old whispers from the elders. Those who tried to claim too much from the heavens were never the same again. But fear was drowned by fascination. The silver thread seemed to invite him, to say, without words, that connection was possible if one dared. Then, as if sensing the thought, the thread of moonlight pulsed brighter. Elior gasped, heart hammering. For the first time, it felt like the moon wanted him to reach further, not just to watch, but to touch, to hold, to borrow a fragment of its impossible presence. Elior drew a deep breath, feeling the night wrap around him. Somewhere inside, a quiet, thrilling courage stirred. He didn't know what borrowing the moon would mean, or how it might change him, but he knew he could not turn back. The thread of silver had been offered, and it was only polite, only natural, to take it. He reached out, and the night held its breath. Elior had never been certain what it meant to hear a reply from the heavens. Words seemed inadequate, almost vulgar, compared to the vast, patient presence of the moon. And yet, tonight, it felt as though the moon itself had spoken, not with a voice, but with motion, with light, with a weightless insistence that stirred the air around him. He stretched out his hand, trembling, and the thread of silver light responded. It wound delicately around his fingers, warm and strangely alive. The sensation was impossible to describe. Neither touch nor sight, but something deeper, a presence that hummed inside his bones. Elior closed his eyes, letting it flow through him, filling the hollow places he had never admitted existed. And then he understood. Not as thought, not as speech, but as feeling, the moon had been waiting. Waiting for someone small enough to see it, patient enough to notice it, brave enough to reach. "You are listening," Elior whispered, his voice catching in the cold night air. I've been trying." The moon pulsed. A gentle ripple of silver flowed along the thread, like a nod, like acknowledgement. It was the first time Elior felt truly seen. The loneliness that had nested in his chest for years loosened its claws, replaced by a dizzying, tender connection. The night deepened, but Elior no longer noticed the chill. He was suspended in a moment out of time, a fragile bubble where boy and moon existed alone. Every flicker of silver light carried a language he did not yet understand, yet somehow felt in every part of him. The world below, the village, the narrow alleys, the silent rooftops, had vanished. There was only the pulse of light in his hands, the steady glow in the sky, and the rhythm of his own racing heart. Then, almost imperceptibly, the moon stretched its glow further, brushing against his palms with a weightless insistence, inviting him to reach beyond what he thought possible. Elior's breath caught. He realized that answering was not just a matter of listening, it was an act of trust. The moon was offering itself, tentatively, to a boy who had dared to dream beyond the edges of his village. He smiled, trembling. I will be careful," he promised. Not because the moon demanded it, but because he felt the gravity of the gift, fragile as spun glass. The stars blinked softly, almost in applause, and for the first time, Elior felt the infinite expanse of the night not as something distant and terrifying, but as a companion. The moon had answered, and in doing so, had asked something of him: courage, patience, and the willingness to step toward the impossible. For hours, the boy and the moon stayed in quiet communion, connected by a single, silver thread. When Elior finally climbed down from the roof, his fingers still tingling with the memory, he felt a shift in himself, a new awareness, a fragile confidence, and a whisper of something yet to come. Because now, the moon was no longer just light in the sky. It was a promise. And promises, as Elior would soon learn, were never given lightly. Elior awoke the next morning with a strange heaviness in his chest, as if the night's silver thread had left a shadow behind. The sun rose timidly, painting the village in soft gold, but the light felt different, familiar, yet insufficient. He had touched the moon, held a fragment of eternity in his hands, and now the world below seemed smaller, duller, as though the colors themselves were apologizing for their ordinariness. He wandered through the streets, careful not to meet the eyes of anyone else. The villagers moved in their usual rhythm, merchants called out, women carried baskets of bread, children laughed in the alleys. Yet Elior felt detached, his heart still echoing with the pulse of moonlight. The thread of silver remained in his mind, delicate and unyielding, whispering that the gift of connection carried its own cost. By midday, he realized what had changed. Shadows lingered differently around him, bending in ways they never had. The wind seemed to brush against his skin with deliberate intention. Even the birds in the trees paused, watching, waiting. The world itself had shifted its attention toward him, and he could feel its weight pressing, gentle but unrelenting. That evening, as he climbed once more to the roof, the moon hung low, luminous and expectant. It pulsed softly, inviting him again, but Elior hesitated. He had glimpsed the first truth. To borrow the moon was to alter not just himself, but the world around him. Every reach left traces. Every desire echoed. He realized that nothing given by the heavens was without consequence. I don't know if I'm ready, he whispered, voice trembling. Is this what it costs? To touch something so immense? The moon shimmered brighter, brushing a tendril of silver across his hand. It did not scold or withdraw, it only waited. Waiting was its language, and patience its gift. And in that waiting, Elior understood another truth: the moon's light was not infinite. To borrow even a fragment meant carrying a weight, and the heart must bend to hold it. He thought of the villagers, of the quiet houses sleeping below. He thought of the girl who sometimes watched him from afar, her eyes wide with curiosity and unspoken wonder. And he realized, the moon's gift was not just light or warmth, it was responsibility. A small mistake, a selfish desire, could unravel everything he had glimpsed. Elior closed his eyes and let the silver thread wrap around him once more. He felt both immense and infinitesimal at once, a boy holding eternity in his hands, yet tethered to the small, fragile village below. The night deepened, the stars blinked softly, and Elior understood, with a quiet, aching clarity, that borrowing the moon was never simply about wonder. It was about sacrifice, patience, and courage. And he was ready to learn all three. After that evening, Elior noticed subtle changes in the rhythm of the night. The darkness lingered longer than usual, stretching over the village like a velvet curtain. Lamps that had always burned steadily flickered uncertainly. Shadows grew soft, then sharp, as if testing the edges of the world. And everywhere, the moon hung lower, closer, watching him with an intimacy that both thrilled and terrified him. On the rooftop, Elior traced the silver thread again, feeling it coil around his fingers like a living thing. The connection pulsed gently, a heartbeat unlike his own. With every touch, he sensed the fragile balance between what he had taken and what the night had given. The moon was patient, but even patience could not exist without consequence. He noticed the villagers moving differently, too. Some paused mid-step, staring at the sky with an unease they could not explain. Others whispered about strange dreams and restless sleep. The world beneath him had shifted imperceptibly, subtly, yet irrevocably. Elior did not sleep that night. He lay on the roof, letting the moon's silver light brush across his face, tracing the line of his cheek, the curve of his hand. It was comforting, yet he felt an echo of warning in its glow. Borrowed light, he realized, casts its own shadow. The moon pulsed again, almost impatiently this time, as though encouraging him to explore further. Elior lifted his hands higher, daring to imagine what it would be like to cradle the glow, to gather it like water in a bowl. His heart raced. Each pulse of the silver thread brought warmth, but also a weight he had not yet understood. From below, he heard a soft cry, a dog barking, a child stirring in its sleep, or perhaps a whisper of the night itself. He could not tell. The line between the ordinary and the magical had begun to blur. The longer he held the moonlight, the more the world below seemed to lean toward him, waiting, listening, trembling. Elior realized then that he was no longer simply a boy watching the sky. He had become part of it. Every heartbeat, every breath, every small act of curiosity had threaded him into the fabric of the night. And the moon, patient and luminous, had begun to teach him its own truth. To borrow its light was to live with a quiet, invisible weight, and to love it was to risk losing everything else. Yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, Elior smiled. The night had grown longer, yes, but so had his courage. And as he reached once more toward the luminous glow above, he felt something stir, a promise that the boy who dared to touch the moon might also learn to hold it. The next night, Elior noticed something unsettling. Shadows no longer behaved as they once had. They twisted and stretched across the village in strange, impossible ways, elongating along walls, slipping through corners, and pooling beneath trees where no light fell. Even his own shadow moved independently, quivering slightly before settling in shapes that seemed to mimic his emotions. At first, he thought it was a trick of the moonlight, a reflection of his imagination. But then he saw the shadows of the other villagers, stretching too long, shifting too freely, as if the borrowed light had begun to rewrite the rules of the world. The night had grown alive, and Elior felt both awe and dread in equal measure. He climbed to his rooftop, heart pounding. The moon hung low, luminous and heavy, almost close enough to touch. The silver thread he had come to recognize pulsed in his hands, but now it seemed more insistent, more demanding. It was not angry or cruel, it was simply aware. Elior spoke softly, almost pleadingly. I didn't mean to change anything. The moon shimmered in response, brushing a thin streak of silver across the tiles. It was a gentle gesture, yet in it Elior sensed a warning. Every act of borrowing left traces. Every pulse of light left a ripple in the world. Shadows had begun to move without source, and perhaps this was only the beginning. He wandered the village streets carefully, noticing things he had never seen before. A stray cat paused mid-step, its shadow bending backward. A well that had always reflected only the sky now mirrored strange, rippling forms. Even the river seemed to hold fragments of silver in its dark waters, as if the moonlight itself had seeped into the currents. The villagers slept unaware, but Elior felt the weight of consequence pressing down on him. Borrowing the moon was not merely about wonder or connection, it was about responsibility. Every playful reach, every whispered wish, carried a cost he could no longer ignore. On the rooftop, he held the silver thread tightly, letting it coil around his fingers, feeling the warmth of eternity in his grasp. And in the silence between pulses, he made a promise to himself. He would learn the rules, understand the limits, and respect the gift. But deep in the night, he could not shake the feeling that the shadows, untethered and restless, were only the beginning of what was to come. The moon had been generous, but even generosity has boundaries, and Elior sensed that the first real test of courage, of patience, and of heart was fast approaching. Elior had grown accustomed to the moon's presence, to the silver thread that pulsed like a heartbeat in his hands. But he had not expected to be seen, not by the villagers, not by anyone at all. Yet one night, as he balanced on the sloping roof, whispering quietly to the moon, he noticed a figure standing in the courtyard below. A girl, no older than himself, with wide, curious eyes and hair like nightfall, was staring upward. She didn't blink or look away. She watched him with a quiet intensity that made Elior's pulse stutter. He froze. I didn't mean to bother you, he whispered, almost instinctively. But the girl only smiled, faint and secretive, as if she had known all along. Her presence startled him. For nights, the moon had been his solitary companion, a friend of silver light and quiet whispers. To have another human witness, even silently, felt both thrilling and terrifying. He feared the gift would be questioned, misunderstood, or worse, taken away. The girl crouched among the shadows, her eyes fixed on the roof. She carried a small notebook of her own, filled with sketches of stars, moons, and impossible patterns. Her hand hovered over a page, trembling slightly, as if trying to capture the motion of the moonlight he had held so many times. You see it too, Elior said softly, voice trembling. The girl nodded, her eyes shining. I've seen it for nights, she whispered. The moon, it's different near you. Elior's chest tightened. No one had ever spoken so simply about what he felt, about the strange intimacy between boy and sky. It was as though she had glimpsed the silver thread, the pulse of eternity he had carried alone. "You're not afraid?" he asked, cautious. The moon hovered above, luminous and patient, its light spilling over both rooftops like a bridge. "I was afraid at first," she admitted. "But it feels like it's waiting for someone to notice it." "Waiting for you." Elior smiled, though uncertainty still lingered. The moonlight pulsed, brushing against him as though acknowledging her presence. For the first time, he realized that the magic he had cherished in solitude could now be shared, if carefully. Yet, as they watched together, he noticed the shadows moving strangely again, twisting along walls and trees. The girl's presence did not calm them. If anything, it seemed the world itself had begun to take notice, not just of him, but of the silver light that had begun to thread through the night. Elior understood, with a quiet ache. The first human witness was a gift, but also a complication. Borrowing the moon was no longer only his secret. And when magic and curiosity collide, nothing in the night stays predictable. The moon hovered above, patient and luminous. And for the first time, Elior realized that the night had room enough for both wonder and caution, for both a boy and a girl who dared to reach. The next night, Elior waited for the girl on the rooftop, his heart beating with a mixture of excitement and unease. She arrived silently, moving with the grace of someone accustomed to shadows. They sat together, side by side, letting the moonlight wash over them. The silver glow no longer felt distant, it hummed with warmth, almost as if it recognized the two of them as a single thread of curiosity. The moon hung lower than ever, its surface shimmering with a gentle luminescence that seemed almost liquid. Elior reached out, instinctively, and felt the familiar pulse wrap around his fingers. But tonight, it was different. Stronger. Closer. He could feel its weight pressing softly, insistently, against the roof beneath him, as if it were testing its ability to lean toward the earth without breaking the rules of the sky. "You can feel it, right?" Elior whispered, glancing at the girl. She nodded, eyes wide. "It's alive." Her voice was barely audible, but it carried a certainty that startled him. "It's like it's breathing with us." Elior swallowed. I think it wants us to understand it. To know it. But I'm afraid." The moon pulsed, brushing a thin ribbon of silver over his hand, and a warmth spread through him, chasing away the fear. He realized that it wasn't asking for possession or control, it was asking for attention, for connection, for recognition. It was slipping closer, yes, but it did so gently, inviting him, not demanding. The girl reached out as well, letting her fingers hover near the light. When her fingertips brushed it, the moon shimmered and rippled, casting patterns across the rooftops that neither of them had ever seen before. Shadows danced, elongated, and then folded back into themselves, forming shapes that seemed almost like letters, but letters of some language older than the village, older than the night. Elior gasped. "It's showing us something." She nodded slowly. "I think it's teaching us." For hours, they sat together, hands barely touching the silver glow, learning the rhythm of the moon's pulse. Time lost meaning. The village below slept, oblivious, while the night above seemed to expand, stretching infinitely around them. Each flicker of the thread felt like a heartbeat shared between boy, girl, and celestial body. But in the back of Elior's mind, a whisper of caution lingered. Shadows had grown restless before. And the moon, though gentle and patient, was immense and powerful, a weight that could not be contained by mere curiosity alone. As dawn approached, the silver thread slowly retracted, leaving their hands tingling with memory. They exchanged a glance, understanding without words that something had begun that could not be undone. The moon had slipped closer tonight, and in doing so, it had invited them to step further into the unknown.